well, let's get going. Everyone can see that what the title is, and Edoardo and Diana.
Okay, thank you for this introduction. And today I'm going to present a work in progress paper manuscript is a joint work with Diana Mazzarella, and it's called "The Burden of Communication: Is There a Real Developmental Dilemma?" ? So we are at the very early stage of this work, so we will be very happy to collect some feedbacks and suggestions about this sketchy argument that we would like to develop. So let me firstly begin with a very brief remarks about one of the key tenets of the ostensive-inferential model of communication. It is that when communicating, speaker expresses two kinds of intention. The first one is the informative intention, namely the intention to inform the hearer of something, or more technically, to make more manifest to the hearer a proposition or an array of propositional contents. And the second intention is the communicative intention. That is the intention to inform the hearer of the speaker's informative intention. It has been technically defined as the intention to make mutually manifest the speaker informative intention. So basically, according to the ostensive inferential model, communication relies on a structure of nested communicative and informative intention. And we propose to graphically represent this intentional structure of a nested mental state in the following way. As you can see in the bigger cycle, we have the communicative intention, which is a second order intention, a second order mental states, spelled out as the speaker intends the hearer to recognize that she has an informative intention, that is a first order intention or a first order mental states, spelled out as the speaker intends to inform the hearer that speaks. So as you can see from this picture, we have two nested intentions, two different order of mental states, and the informative content, which is conveyed by way of an ostensive act of communication, is embedded with this nested intentional structure of informative and communicative intention. And today we want to focus on the claim that the inferential interpretation of the act of ostensive communication would require entertaining this nested structure of informative and communicative intention. Because many scholars criticize this claim by calling into question its plausibility in accounting for the early interpretative abilities of very young children, especially when it comes to children in the preverbal age, so before the acquisition of a full-fledged language. And both philosophers and psychologists pointed to the existence of a kind of a developmental dilemma for the ostensive inferential model, and more generally from the Gricean account of communication. And this dilemma has been developed in several ways throughout the literature. Today, we want to focus on a specific formulation of this dilemma, which has been called in the literature the complex inference objection. And here I quote the formulation of this objection provided by Richard Moore in a paper of 2017. Moore writes, proponents of the complex inferences objection, for example, Dorit Baron, hold that Gricean communication requires making inferences about a speaker's communicative goal, and that these make it too difficult for developing minds. Others have raised similar concern in even stronger terms. For example, Davidson, 1974, worried that since our primary knowledge of other minds come from what they say, then in the absence of a common language, this mind would remain opaque to us. Well, our overall aim in this work is to try to address this complex inference objection by endorsing a relevance-theoretic perspective. However, we think that the formulation of this objection is somehow too broad to be addressed perspicuously. Therefore, our primary aim is to try to spell out this objection by disentangling different possible reasons for these alleged complexities about the inferences about speakers' communicative goal. because these possible results that could be distinguished are very often confounded and intertwined in the literature. So in order to pursue this clarificatory aim of this objection, we propose to move from the following question. What is complex about making inferences about a speaker's communicative goals? Well, we think that we could distinguish at least two main sources of this complexity. The first one is that what is complex is making the inference, so is the inferential process, given the quality of the available evidence for drawing this inference. Because it could be that, especially without a spoken language, which is the situation in which preverbal infants find themselves, this evidence for drawing this inference could not be rich enough. But in talking about evidence, we could also distinguish between evidence for the presence of a communicative intention or evidence for the content communicated. And this is the first main source of the complexity that we individuated in this objection. While the second source of complexity in this case is not the inferential procedure itself, but it's the inferable. So what needs to be inferred, namely this intentional structure of nested informative and communicative intention. So today we will try to sketch an argument, a line of an argument to address these different sub-objection, starting from the first two. 1A, alleged poor evidence for presence of communicative intention, and 1B. Well, we think that both 1A and 1B can somehow be addressed by drawing on the many empirical studies on developmental psychologists about the early engagement of infants and children on ostensive form of communication. And those studies highlight the relevance of some rudimentary forms of signaling, which are called ostensive signal. And for example, three very conventionalized instances of ostensive signals are direct gaze that result in mutual eye contact, motherly stalk, which is the kind of altered prosody by way of which caregivers address children, and early turn-taking play. And according to this line of thought in developmental psychologists, indeed, ostensive signals can provide a strong evidence for the presence of a communicative intention from the speaker part. And most importantly, some study also highlights the fact that there could be almost innate tendency to detect this kind of signals and to preferentially direct the attention from infant's part to the processing of this kind of ostensive signals. So we think that this line of argument could be used to somehow address the objection 1A, the alleged poor evidence for the presence of a communicative intention, because indeed ostensive signals provide a strong non-verbal and very early detected evidence for communicative intention. And moreover, the early sensitivity and preference for ostensive signals would put preverbal infants in a kind of a privileged position for recognizing and grasping the speaker communicative intention. But what about 1B, so the alleged poor evidence for the content communicated? Well, we would concede the point that obviously without the linguistic means, without a spoken language, the resources for inferentially reconstruct what is communicated by a speaker is very poor, the inference is very hard to be worked out. However, there are also other kinds of studies in this in this current of studies about ostensive signals that investigated the expectation which are triggered once an information is provided ostensibly to a child. And these expectations are broadly described as expectation of relevance that could also facilitate some learning processes in some specific context. So even if we concede the point that the evidence for the content communicated in preverbal age is very poor, however, this inferential process of reconstruction of the speaker meaning is not a completely blind process, because it could be guided by some strong pragmatic expectation that could act as constraints on the interpretative inferential process. But what about the second source of complexity? So what needs to be inferred? Well, in this case, the difficulty arises because of the meta-representational complexity of this intentional structure. Therefore, to deal with this objection, we suggest to focus on the possible direction of the inference by way of which the addressee of an ostensive communication could come to entertain this nested structure of informative and communicative intention. And one suggestion comes again from Csibra, but this is also a line of thought that seems to be shared in the whole relevance-theoretic framework, that the direction of inference starts from the attribution of a communicative intention that triggers a relevance-guided inference that recover the content which is communicated. And so we want to try to develop to develop the hypothesis that maybe this direction of inference could somehow reduce the meta-representational burden which is required for inferring ostensive acts of communication. And to try to explore from an analytical point of view this hypothesis about the reduced meta-representational burden, we suggest to compare this direction of the inference which is involved in case of ostensive communication with other kinds of inference to different kinds of second-order mental states where there is no ostension. So where we could say roughly that the recipient loses a privileged position to infer the relevant underlying intention. And one very interesting example which is discussed in the literature is the case of hidden authorship, which is an instance of a covert information transmission. And here we reported adapted version of a very nice experiment run by Grossi, Scott-Phillips, and Tomasello of hidden authorship. So, for example, suppose that we are in a situation where Mary is composing a puzzle and she does not find the missing piece of the puzzle. And Mary does not want any help. She wants to finish the puzzle all alone. And Peter is in the same room, wants to help Mary, and place in a surreptitious way the missing piece of the puzzle where Mary can notice it, not directly bringing her attention to his informative action. So there is no ostension in this case. There is a covert provision of information. Well, hidden authorship is very interesting from an analytical point of view because it could be analyzed in terms of two orders of intention. So in this particular case, Peter has an informative intention. He wants to inform Mary about something and is acting on that informative intention. However, he also wants to keep this informative intention hidden in virtue of a second order negative communicative intention. And the whole process could be spelled out as Peter intends Mary not to recognize that Peter intends to inform Mary that the missing piece is here. And what is interesting of hidden authorship is that the meta-representational complexity of hidden authorship somehow mirror the same complexity of ostensive communication. But the difference is that in a case of ostensive communication, so in a case in which, for example, Peter points ostensibly toward the missing piece of the puzzle, Peter, in this case, wants to make manifest both her informative and his informative and his communicative intention. While in hidden authorship, the informative intention is kept hidden in virtue of the second order negative communicative intention. And we could also imagine a scenario in which this hidden authorship intent is being spotted by Mary. So suppose that Mary realized that Peter tried to help her in a covert way. And in this case, we could imagine or we can reconstruct the interpretative steps by way of which Mary could come to entertain this iterated structure of higher order mental states. So for example, suppose that at T1, Mary sees the evidence, the missing piece, and she would come to entertain a fog with a content, the missing piece is here. then she would realize that probably this evidence has been intentionally provided by Peter, thus inferring the first order intention. Peter intended to inform me that the missing piece is here. But then she would also realize that Peter intended to keep this informative intention hidden, thus inferring the second order negative communicative intention. Well, as you can see from this, from our reconstruction, in this case, the direction of the inference goes from the content to the first to the second order intention. So this is a kind of incremental process of inference to higher order mental states that proceed step by step. And we found it reasonable to say that this incremental process of inference is cognitively demanding, way more cognitively demanding than processing act of ostensive communication. And if we put in comparison these two cases, we could see that while in hidden authorship, we had this kind of bottom-up process of incremental inference to higher order mental states, in ostensive communication, we have a top-down inference from the communicative intention to the inferential reconstruction of the content. And we would like to suggest that what can indeed reduce the complexity of the inference to the intentional structure posited by the ostensive inferential model is this different direction of the inference that could be highlighted between different of all comparable kinds of second order mental states. And this would open up the possibility, first a theoretical possibility of observing, an empirical possibility of observing even an earlier emergence of the cognitive capacity needed to grasp this intentional structure. So by concluding, let me take stock of what we try to sketch today. We spell out the complex inference objection in 3 sub-objections, poor evidence for the communicative intention, and we suggest to address this sub-objection by looking at the studies on ostensive signals that could provide strong non-verbal, early detected evidence for communicative intention, poor evidence for the content communicated, and then we highlight the inference, which is triggered by ostension that is guided by strong expectation of relevance, and the meta-representational complexity of the intentional structure. In this case, we try to draw a comparison between different kind of inference to higher order mental states and highlighting the peculiar direction of the inference in case of ostensive communication. So the gist of our argument in this case is that the apparent formal complexity of a level of meta-representation involved does not necessarily go along with analogous cognitively complexity. Thank you so much for your attention and to the organizer for putting together this very fun conference.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And I guess now I do see hands already. So now, Nausicaa, you want to get going?
Thanks, Edoardo. That was a great talk, extraordinarily interesting, and very nice work. Okay, so I think what I want to ask about is the link between the very first argument you make, A, and the very last argument you make. So I completely buy this idea that the direction of inferencing would make all the difference. But I think one of the core questions is, in the usual case, no hidden authorship, everything goes well. Do you need, in the end, to represent the nested structure? Because the way you present it, in a sense, it looks as if you get it directly from possibly even some innate mechanisms. So do you need this representation? I completely buy that you don't need to go back to it inferentially, and I think you're absolutely right that that makes a huge amount of difference. But I think one of the issues is really, do you need this representation at all, or do you not need it? Do you need something, well, a lighter version of it? that would be sufficient to then trickle down the process of inferencing back, well, towards what is the intended meaning, basically. So well, you framed it in terms of research for relevance.
Thank you, Nausicaa, for this question. It's very, very relevant. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's the core question, especially when we try to address the interpretative abilities of young children. So whether this intentional structure has to be grasped in this kind of a nested way. So first the communicative, and then the informative intention, and then the content, or whether maybe young children only represent the intentional structure as a kind of a whole, and then from the ostension they go through a process of inference to the content. Well, I cannot provide a very, very convincing answer to this question, because we are trying to working on the idea of a lighter version of this inferential structure, of this intentional structure, especially in the case of children engagement in ostensive communication. The little technical issue in which we are recently discussing with Diana is whether indeed infants or preverbal infants or even very young children are able to grasp the communicative intention as defined technically by relevance theory. So as an intention to make mutually manifest the speaker informative intention. Because from a theoretical point of view, what needs the two criteria for something to be mutually manifest is that it is mutually manifest to both the interlocutors, and that the same thing that is mutually manifest enter in the cognitive environment of both interlocutors. And I don't know, maybe the one problem one theoretical problem could be that children in the first year of their age are not really able to have this mutually manifestness of the informative intention. So we would like to develop also this idea that maybe children comes to entertain this intentional structure in an unnested way. So grasping the ostension and then going through an inferential process of reconstructing what is communicated, a relevance process, but not going into a representation of this intentional structure. But this is the very early stage of for sure. This is the rogue idea. I don't know whether I answered to your question.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Just a very quick clarification. When you talk just now of recognizing that something is mutually manifest, and you talk about the first year, do you really talk about the first year or the first years? So are you talking about the first 12 months, where, I mean, at least until 9 months, we're before, the kind of cognitive revolution, as it has been coined, that gets you to communication? Or do you mean the first years as after the start of communicative? Because the evidence, once the children start to be in the communicative realm, like properly, like pointing, etc., is more, I mean, I would think that there's quite a bit that suggests there is a recognition of mutual manifest in some way. So I was wondering, is it before 12 months or after 12 months?
It's before 12 months.
Okay.
Deirdre? Do you want to unmute yourself?
You can see how unused I am to Zoom. I thought that was a really beautiful talk. I was actually totally convinced. I had a similar question to Nausicaa's, but that's not the one I want to raise. It's about the fact that going from the ostensive signal in the direction of the content is easier than going the other way around, which is what you were arguing. I noticed you didn't mention the relevance-guided comprehension heuristic. And it's always been a question in my mind whether that is something that's, as it were, evolved only to deal with linguistic communication. I've assumed that it deals with pointing and other things. You look for the most salient thing that's relevant and assume that's what the speaker meant, as it were. And I just noticed you could be sort of innately endowed with some procedure like that, which would again make it much easier to go from the ostensive signal to a hypothesis about the content. I just wondered, since you know about children and I don't, whether that heuristic should make things easier to interpret nonverbal communication.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for this remark. Yeah, I didn't mention the relevance-theoretic guided procedure, but yeah, it was somehow assumed. I mean, the inference that is triggered, it was guided by expectation of relevance. The little point is that I totally agree with this point. In the developmental literature, somehow these expectations are not directly defined as expectation of relevance, because they are defined as a more general expectation about referentiality. So where we could look to find an object, or expectation of generalization of an information across individual that may support learning processes. But yeah, I mean, I will be in that line of the argument. In case that what is triggered is a relevance-guided theoretic relevance-guided procedure, which make it less effort and is a kind of a heuristic. So it could be also implemented in a kind of a module.
Exactly.
You're very, very early on in development.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It was a lovely talk.
Tom, I think we have time for at least one more question.
Super. Thank you. Thank you for the talk. I mean, it won't be a surprise that I'm extremely sympathetic to what you're saying and what you're arguing. I want to ask a question. I think in some ways is a bad question, but I've had versions of the debates that you're talking about. I've had versions of those conversations a number of times over the years. I'm going to try and channel the people that take the opposite view to people like you and I. At the end, you said, you summarized three possible ways in which there could be a challenge to developmentally, and you talked about the meta-representational structure. In my experience, that's the one that people point to most of all. When I've spoken, particularly, and it's not just developmentalists, it's primatologists too. They point to this meta-representational structure, and they say that is far too complicated for what's going on. And the evidence that they bring to try and substantiate that argument is to point out that infants fail false belief tasks until 4 years of age. And that's a first order meta-representational task. Why are they wrong?
I mean, this is an issue which is highly debated and controversial in the developmental literature.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, probably they are wrong. Probably false belief attribution could be even topped with more implicit kind of paradigm. But in the kind of modular perspective that I'm trying to pursue, I will be tend to distinguish between these two kind of cognitive abilities. So the first order belief, in this case, of belief as a mental states, and communicative intention that appears to be a very kind of a particular mental state, that is audience direct mental state, in contrast with a belief. And moreover, another difference is that as a mental state audience direct, it could be encoded in some behavioral cues, such as cue for ostension. And most importantly, the point that we try to outline today is that extension and communicative intention recognition could trigger this kind of assisted kind of inference. And this assisted kind of inference is not elicited in a case in which we have to simply represent the belief of another person. There is no help to, so to say, from the interlocutor, the other agent parts, to reconstruct what is going into her mind.
So if just
interesting. Sorry, Tom. It's interesting is that
I get
line of things. We're actually at time, so sorry to cut you off.